first thing Vorgath said to me was not hello, it was not greetings, or peace be upon your species, or any of the polished, diplomatic phrases the Galactic Accord supposedly trained its exchange warriors to use. He stepped off the shuttle ramp at Lagos International Spaceport at 6 in the morning, looked down at me with 4 orange eyes the size of fists, and said, in a voice that vibrated my back teeth, "Human, feed me. I am Sergeant Daria Okonkwo. I run the integration desk at the UN Gaia compound in Lagos, which means I am the woman responsible for making sure visiting alien liaisons do not accidentally cause a diplomatic incident, a public panic, or a food shortage. In 11 years of doing this job, I had managed 32 alien visitors. I had handled a jury who was allergic to wind. I had managed a Tarathi dignitary who communicated exclusively through harmonic resonance and kept causing car alarms to go off. I thought I had seen everything. I had not seen Vorgath. He was 9 feet tall. His body was covered in interlocking plates of dark chitin that caught the early morning light like polished volcanic rock. He had 4 arms, 2 large and angular on top, 2 smaller and precise below, and he moved with the kind of careful, deliberate weight that told you his body understood exactly how much damage it could do if it stopped being careful. He smelled like ozone and iron and something I could not name, something ancient and sharp. He was also, very clearly, starving. I took him to the nearest place I knew. 3 blocks from the spaceport, Mama Chidinma had been running her buka stall since before I was born. She opened at 5. She fed cab drivers, nurses coming off night shifts, market traders setting up early. She had never in her life seen anything like what walked through her gate that morning, but she looked at Vorgath the way she looked at everyone who sat down at her bench, like he was simply another person who needed feeding, and she said, "Sit down." "Sit down," I said. "You want rice?" He sat. The bench groaned. He looked at the plate she put in front of him. He ate. He ate that plate in about 45 seconds. He ate the second plate in 30. He looked at Mama Chidinma with an expression I would later learn was the Krathali version of deep spiritual respect. And he said, simply and with great feeling, "More." She gave him more. He ate that too. He worked through her morning stock methodically, plate by plate, with total focus and zero apology. By the time the sun was properly up, he had consumed what she normally sold to 60 customers, and he was sitting back with his 4 arms resting on his knees, looking at the empty pots with the expression of a man who has, for the first time in days, stopped being in pain. "Good," he said. "This is very good." Mama Chidinma put her hands on her hips and looked at me. "He coming back tomorrow?" I said I did not know. I said I would pay for everything, and I would explain later, and I was sorry for the chaos. She waved me off. She was already calculating what she would need to cook extra. Back at the compound, I filed my incident report and read, for the first time, the full Krathali biological briefing that my supervisor had apparently assumed I would read before the pickup. The document was thorough and deeply alarming. Krathali warriors evolved on a high-gravity world with scarce resources. Their bodies were built to store almost nothing and burn everything immediately. In what the file called a resting state, Vorgath needed approximately 14,000 calories per Earth day to maintain basic function. In acclimation phase, which is the state a Krathali enters when adjusting to a new planet, a new atmosphere, new gravity, new food, the number climbed to between 22 and 28,000 calories daily. The file noted, at the bottom of page 7, in the kind of calm language that bureaucrats use when they want to say something terrifying without seeming alarmed, host nations are advised to prepare significant food infrastructure prior to arrival. I called my supervisor. He laughed for a long time and then told me that this was, unfortunately, now my problem. I spent the next 4 days running logistics like I was coordinating disaster relief. I contracted 3 restaurants within walking distance of the compound. I arranged daily deliveries from a wholesale market. I set up a schedule that had food arriving at the compound every 3 hours, because if Vorgath went more than 4 hours without eating, he became what his file described as metabolically distressed, which in practice meant he sat very still, made a low sound that I can only describe as the noise a building makes just before something structural gives way, and looked at everything around him with the focused attention of a creature calculating whether it was edible. He was never threatening, He never reached for anything he should not, but a 9-foot predator staring at your furniture with hungry eyes is its own kind of pressure. By the end of the week, the compound kitchen was empty twice before noon. One of the restaurants had called me to say, apologetically, that they needed 2 days to restock, and a message had arrived from Galcom Oversight flagging that Vorgath's food expenditure in 6 days had already exceeded the integration desk's quarterly operating budget. Then came the formal notice. Galcom sent it on a Friday afternoon, which felt deliberate. The notice explained that Vorgath's previous host planet, a species called the Jury, had ended the exchange after 8 days. The Jury were small and photosynthetic and deeply peaceful, and they had tried to manage Vorgath's appetite with a rationing schedule. He had not complained, he had not caused damage. He had simply been constantly, loudly, resonantly hungry, and his distress calls in the night had proven psychically overwhelming for the Jury, who communicated through something like shared emotional frequency. They had asked Galcom, very politely, to please take him back. The notice then said that if Earth could not adequately provision the war champion, the exchange would be considered a failure. Earth's candidacy for full Galactic Accord membership, currently on probation, would be formally reviewed. Review, in Galcom language, meant suspension. Suspension meant we lost every trade agreement, every research partnership, every seat at every table we had spent a decade earning. We were going to lose our place in the galaxy because we could not feed one very large man. I sat at my desk at midnight with a spreadsheet open and a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I thought about my grandmother. She had fed 30 people from a pot made for 10, every Sunday, without fail, without complaint. She never asked if she could afford it. She asked who was coming and what they liked, and whether anyone had allergies. She treated feeding people as a form of architecture, something you built carefully so everyone fit inside it. I closed the spreadsheet. I opened a new document. I started writing. The proposal I took to UN Gaia Secretary General Nina Holt was called the Vorgath Initiative. The core idea was simple: stop treating Vorgath's appetite as a compound logistics problem and start treating it as a community resource question. Earth had fed millions of people in crisis. Earth ran festivals that served 100,000 people a day. Earth had supply chains and rotating kitchens, and a food culture so vast and varied that no single nation had ever mapped all of it. The solution was not to carry Vorgath alone. The solution was to let Earth carry him together. I proposed a rotating host program. Every 2 weeks, Vorgath would travel to a new country. Each country would treat it as a national event. They would showcase their food, their chefs, their hospitality. They would compete, quietly and joyfully, to be the place that fed him best. Secretary General Holt looked at me for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "You want to turn feeding an alien warrior into a point of pride." "I want to turn it into what it already is," I said, "a test of what we can do when we decide something matters." She approved it before lunch. Vorgath's first official stop was Lagos, which was also his unofficial first stop, and which Mama Chidinma had already claimed as her territory. She hired 4 assistants. She started cooking the night before. She treated Vorgath's daily meals with the focused intensity of someone catering a state dinner, except louder and with more pepper. He ate egusi soup with goat meat one morning and sat so still afterward that I thought something was wrong, until I realized he was experiencing what I can only describe as culinary awe. He looked at the empty bowl, and then at Mama Chidinma, and said, very quietly, "This is the best thing I have eaten in 4 years." She said, "You should have come sooner." Then came Japan. The Japanese team approached the challenge like an engineering problem, which is to say, with total precision and complete devotion. 20 chefs working in rotating shifts around the clock. A schedule of meals timed to Vorgath's metabolic cycles, which the team had researched and charted. Every ingredient sourced at peak quality. When Vorgath encountered ramen, the real kind, the kind built from a broth cooked for 12 hours, he went completely silent for 30 seconds. Then he bowed to the chef. A full, deliberate bow, forearms folded in the Krathali gesture that, I was told later, warriors reserved for moments of genuine honor. The chef, a quiet man named Henry Wada, who had been cooking for 40 years, stood very straight and bowed back, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Mexico came next, and everything got louder. Street food is not a category in Mexico, it is a philosophy. The family running the taqueria near the cultural center treated Vorgath's arrival like a family reunion for someone they had not met yet. They fed him standing at the counter, plate after plate, and he learned 3 Spanish words that week: more, please, and delicious. And he used all 3 constantly, and with tremendous sincerity. On the last day of his visit, the family invited him to their daughter's birthday celebration. He attended. He sat in a chair that had been reinforced by a local welder, and he watched the dancing, and at some point, he began to make a low sound that rattled the windows very gently, and the family's grandmother, who was 81 and had no patience for anything she did not understand, asked me what that sound was. I told her it was how Krathali expressed emotion when they were too moved to find words. She nodded and went back to dancing. In India, the stop that everyone had been quietly anticipating, a retired chef named Oliver Day took personal charge of the arrangements. He was 70 years old, small and precise, and he had cooked for prime ministers and refused to be impressed by that, and he was not impressed by Vorgath either, which Vorgath seemed to find deeply refreshing. Oliver cooked for 6 hours before Vorgath arrived, and 6 hours after he sat down, sending out dishes in a continuous procession that moved from light to heavy and back to light again, following a logic that Oliver explained was about respecting the eater's journey as much as the food itself. Vorgath ate in attentive silence. Between dishes he asked questions, genuine questions, about why certain spices were combined in certain orders, and what the cooking did to them that eating them raw would not. Oliver answered each question at length, and Vorgath listened with the total focus of someone who had decided that this conversation was the most important thing currently happening anywhere. By the 3rd hour, they had stopped being host and guest, and become, strangely and completely, 2 people discussing craft. Oliver told me later that he had never had a conversation about cooking quite like it. He understood, Oliver said, that food is not just what you eat, it is what you decide to make. Every choice is a statement. He understood that immediately. In Australia, the approach was different in a way that was entirely predictable and also exactly right. A group of ranchers in the Northern Territory, having heard that the alien warrior was coming and having done their own research on Krathali metabolic needs, simply prepared the largest barbecue in the property's history, invited everyone within driving distance, and let the whole thing run from noon until midnight. There was no schedule. There was no precision. There was a fire the size of a small building, and meat arriving in quantities that seemed genuinely impossible, and people wandering in and out all day, and Vorgath sitting in the center of it like a dark planet with its own gravity, drawing people toward him without effort. A rancher named Callum Price sat next to him for 4 hours, and they talked about terrain, about how different landscapes produce different animals, and different animals produce different people. And Vorgath said that on Krethal, the connection between land and warrior was considered sacred, that you could tell where a fighter had grown up by how they moved, because the land trained you before any combat instructor ever did. Callum said that made perfect sense to him. They shook hands when Vorgath left, and Callum's hand disappeared entirely inside Vorgath's lower grip, and both of them found that funny. In Georgia, the country, there was a feast table that stretched the length of the room. A man named Patrick Iashvili, who was the tamada, the official toastmaster, stood at the head of the table and made toasts to war and peace and food and mothers and the night sky and the future, and Vorgath listened to every one with complete attention. When it was Vorgath's turn to make a toast, he stood, and in broken Georgian that he had been practicing for 2 days, he raised what the family gave him to drink and said something that the translator rendered as, "To the people who understand that feeding someone is an act of war against sadness." The table went quiet. Then everyone drank. Patrick Iashvili had tears running down his face and was not embarrassed about it at all. I stopped pretending I was not also crying somewhere around month 3. The stories Vorgath told were the part nobody had planned for. A Krathali warrior, it turned out, was culturally required to honor those who fed him, and honor meant sharing, and sharing meant stories. He talked about battles on worlds I had never heard of. He described species that Galcom had not yet catalogued, and star systems that existed only in Krathali oral tradition, He talked about the internal politics of Galcom with a frankness that earned me a very firm diplomatic note and some genuinely fascinating intelligence. He sat with Uncle Emeka at the Suya Grill in Lagos one evening and taught him a blade technique from Krathali cooking tradition, a way of preparing meat that concentrated flavor through the cut rather than the fire, and Emeka adapted it to Suya prep in a way that made 3 food scientists weep when they tried to explain what it was doing chemically. A paper was published. Then 2 more. A research division opened quietly in a pharmaceutical company. A woman named Grace Adeyemi, an agronomist in Ibadan, received a grant to study ultra-dense protein cultivation techniques that she had developed while trying to help source enough food for Vorgath's Lagos weeks. Her work ended up in 12 countries within a year. Earth was advancing because it was trying to feed one hungry alien. The crisis came in month 8, as crises usually do, from a direction that should not have surprised me but did. A logistics contractor filed a cost complaint. A politician called the initiative a misuse of public resources. And a memo arrived from a Galcom efficiency committee suggesting that Vorgath be transitioned, for the remainder of his exchange, to standardized synthetic ration blocks, which were cheap and nutritionally complete, and, as the memo noted, eliminated the current unsustainable expenditure on artisanal food preparation. I read the memo out loud to Vorgath. It was a mistake, in the sense that it was the right thing to do and I knew it would be hard. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "On my world, when a clan can no longer feed its warriors, the warrior does not leave in anger. He leaves in grief, because it means the clan has forgotten what feeding means. It means they have decided that keeping something alive is not the same as honoring that it lives." He looked at me with 4 orange eyes and said, "Do your people wish to forget?" I wrote my counter-report over 14 hours. I pulled every testimony I had. Mama Chidinma, who wrote 2 paragraphs in English and 4 more in Yoruba that I translated. Henry Wada, who sent a single page that was one of the most quietly powerful things I had ever read. Patrick Iashvili, who sent a voice recording because he said some things needed to be heard and not read. Uncle Emeka, who brought me a written statement at 7 in the morning and stayed to make sure I included the part about the knife technique. Grace Adeyemi, who sent her research grant approval letter and a note that said simply, "Tell them what this came from." The Quinceañera family, who sent a photograph of Vorgath at the table with their grandmother on one side and their daughter on the other, all 3 of them laughing at something. I titled the report, "What Earth Learned from Being Asked to Try." It was meant for a UN committee. It ended up in Galcom networks within 48 hours. 14 alien species requested copies. 3 requested reciprocal exchange programs. The synthetic ration proposal was withdrawn without comment, which is the bureaucratic version of pretending something never happened. Vorgath's year ended on a Tuesday morning, which felt wrong. Endings should not happen on Tuesdays. They should happen on days with more weight to them. His last meal on Earth was in Lagos, at Mama Chidinma's place, which had expanded 3 times over the year and now had proper walls and a kitchen that could feed a small army, and a small bronze plaque beside the door that said, simply, "First Table." Half the neighborhood came. Uncle Emeka brought suya, which he carried in so much quantity that it required a second person to help him. There were dishes from every country Vorgath had visited, brought or made by people who had traveled to Lagos specifically to be there. There was a cake, because he had discovered cake in Portugal, and treated it as a revelation that everyone else had been selfishly keeping from him. He ate until he was full, which took a while. Then he stood, and he gave the formal Krathali oration of departure, which the Galcom translator rendered roughly as a warrior's promise to carry the memory of a place into every battle, so that the place lives inside the fighting, and the fighting gives meaning back to the place. He looked at me last. "Sergeant Dari," he said, "you are the first human I will tell my clan of." "What will you tell them?" I asked. He thought about it for a moment, which was not something I had seen him do often. Vorgath was a creature of action, and appetite, and immediate response. Deliberate pauses were rare. "That your people are small," he said, "and strange, and you argue about everything. Your planet smells like 10,000 different foods all happening at the same time, which is either wonderful or overwhelming, depending on the hour. You spend enormous energy debating the wrong things. You are, by every measurable standard, not the most powerful species in the Accord. He paused again. But when something needed feeding, you did not ask if you could afford it. You asked who else could help. He tilted his great dark head slightly. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. He walked up the ramp, the shuttle sealed behind him. I stood in the Lagos heat, with Suya smoke drifting across the morning air, and the sound of the neighborhood going back to its ordinary business around me. 6 months later, Galcom formally upgraded Earth from probationary member to full member of the Galactic Accord. The resolution cited, among other factors, demonstrated capacity for large-scale interspecies resource coordination, cultural adaptability, and sustained diplomatic hospitality under resource pressure. Mama Chidinma framed the Galcom letter and hung it next to the plaque. 3 Krathali warriors submitted requests for Earth as their next exchange posting. I put in a budget request for a dedicated culinary logistics team. It was approved in 4 hours, which was a record. And somewhere out there, crossing the dark between stars, a 9-foot war champion was probably telling his clan about jollof rice, and egusi soup, and ramen broth that takes 12 hours, and the small strange people who made it all, and who never once asked whether it was too much trouble to make sure someone left the table full. He was right. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.